some peanuts and blackjack. I don't care if I never get back. Let's be room for the whole. We may pray, don't wait, it's a day.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jonathan Werner, one of the 5 MLTI ambassadors this year. And today we're talking about digital relationships and communication and the Common Sense Education Curriculum connected to that subject, as well as some frameworks for how to approach your conversations with your students about this that I hope are helpful. The first 6 sessions of Wednesdays with Werner are focused on the Common Sense Education 6 areas of discussion for digital citizenship teaching and learning. And then we go back after April break and we'll look at the questions arising from the media that are one of those 6 components, but which I think deserve several weeks of study because they come up in so many different classes. Sort of a running theme for me is that these conversations need to happen in every classroom with every teacher whenever possible, as well as at home, among peers, in and out of academic settings. But that particular area of media balance, new media, is one where I feel though there's a lot of opportunity, whether it's ELA teachers, social studies, even science, math as well, that having great resources to help determine the appropriateness of a source or the reliability, those kinds of questions, how to cite, just come up so much that it seemed worthy of several weeks of conversation. But all that to say, today we'll look at the unit and lessons related to relationships. But first, if you haven't had an opportunity to see these, as we've explored MLTI 2.0, the opportunity we have all stepped into as ambassadors is to expand on the teaching and learning aspect of the program. It is unfairly, I think, landed now in the category of a device providing program, and certainly that's a huge piece of it. But the goal is really to support digital citizenship education, technology integration, and digital instructional design. So at any point that you think I or one of the other ambassadors could be helpful in your schools, we'd love to connect and talk about ways to do that. But this first gear, information literacy, rights and responsibilities, and internet safety and security, blends beautifully with the Common Sense Education Digital Citizenship Curriculum, and they're a partner of ours on this 2-year journey. So seems like a great way to spend some time examining the resources they have available, which, as you'll hear me say repeatedly, are extraordinary. So they define digital citizenship as the responsible use of technology to learn, create, and participate. I really like that general definition, that it isn't, there's no value judgment related to it. If anything, it's very positive, and they have determined that these 6 categories work really nicely as a place to begin having these conversations by dividing it into these clearly interrelated but somewhat easily understood subcategories. So week 1 on the 9th of March, we looked at news and media literacy, just a brief overview to get a sense of how the Common Sense Education website works. On the 16th, we looked at media balance and well-being with my colleague, Kate Meyer. Privacy and security on the 23rd. Digital footprint and identity last week on March 30th. And today we go to relationships and communication. And for each of these areas, Common Sense has provided an image as well as a kind of tagline. We know the power of words and actions. And as you'll see throughout this curriculum and throughout the sort of approach that Common Sense Education takes, it is consistently very positive and very careful to not focus on the fear or on the negative aspects of how digital citizenship might be taught, but instead on opportunity and on the ways in which technology affords chances to do things that are very different and very unique for students if used appropriately, and that access and that connection is really how they focus all of their curriculum. So to that end, they offer a central question for each of these areas for relationships, it is how can I communicate effectively and positively to build relationships? See what I mean? Very positive. And I did want to pause for a moment to apologize. It is the beginning of allergy season, and if I begin to sneeze wildly, don't worry, you're not going to catch anything. I'm just having an allergy attack. Anyway, so common sense education describing this area talks about interpersonal skills, talks about ways that we strengthen those online communication skills and connect to one another in communities. They also focus on helping students really begin to understand effective modes of communication and ways in which conversations and topics may lend themselves better or not as well to an online conversation or an online discussion. To that end, they ask some sort of related questions to the central one, but they often will explain why it's important to focus on this particular area. And I found this a very compelling reason in what they provide. So they observe that one way we might engage kids in this conversation is by asking questions like, who is my audience? What's the purpose of the message I'm sending? And in what context will people be reading this message? And what we find over and over again is that students are not asking these questions on any kind of regular basis and not thinking about audience, not thinking about purpose, and certainly not thinking about context. And so they're not recognizing the impact that what they're sharing, what they're communicating may have on their audience. And worse still, they may have no idea who their audience is. So those conversations raised by these pretty simple questions, I think, can be invaluable just by themselves. And it's pretty jarring, I'd say, as you start to have these conversations, if you haven't already, to discover just how cavalier, I would say, and unaware students are. And it's certainly not intentional. I think we've made the terrible mistake of thinking that digital natives are digitally skilled, and they aren't anything but. And it really is clear that we need to give them tools and opportunities, safe spaces where they can fail in this process, and not just send them out into the world with what I refer to as the good luck with that theory. It's not something we would ever do for English or swimming or world language, right? We would never just plunk them somewhere and hope for the best. And yet that's exactly what we do so many times with digital interactions. So the whole overarching goal of common sense education, and the reason that I feel so strongly about this, is that we need to fill that vacuum with meaningful discussions for kids and resources that help them. So to that end, Common Sense has assembled this incredible, and just like can't say enough about this series of videos, in which the primary focus is teens speaking their minds, telling you about their experiences. They're not actors, they're real people telling you. I've never understood that expression, right? Everyone's a real person, pretty much, unless they're AI. But anyway, they're real people in the real world, not actors, who are asked questions about each of the subjects. And of the ones that are connected to today's conversation, the Common Sense does a great job matching up the appropriateness of the subject with the age level. But the more overarching theme I want to present to you is that kids talking to kids about kids' issues is as powerful a tool as there is out there. There's really nothing more influential and more sort of conversation sparking, and you will be so impressed with these kids. And the honesty and the sort of transparency with which they give you access to their lives, it is obviously something that would work even better if you can get your own kids talking about it and their personal experiences. But these really beautifully jumpstart the conversations in a way that I've been very, very impressed by. So if you click on the top there, I did a kind of careful Google search term to pull up as many of them as I can in one place. For some reason, they're not all together in a single playlist or anything, but that link on top should help you find them. And then I selected 5 of them that I thought were particularly valuable. Social media boundaries, sexting, which is a really tough but fantastic one. Civil discourse, which is a little different. I'll talk about that in one second. And then who you're talking to online. The civil discourse one is mostly an interview with a kid about why he thinks it's so important that we learn how to have civil discourse online, and how the sort of polarization of our political realm has resulted in totally abandoning meaningful exchanges and conversation. And I heard one of the senators speaking a few weeks ago about his recollections of being a working in one of the senator's offices when he was young, maybe in his early 20s, and he's now in his late 50s. And he said the culture of that office was all about compromise. And when they went to the floor, they went to the floor with the idea that they were going to share ideas and have a back and forth conversation and come to a consensus, or at least a widely agreed upon solution or way to address. And of course, that wasn't, what happened all the time, but he said the proportion of that was so dominant that that is his primary memory of that period of time. And now he finds it is so polarized that there's literally no conversation. It's just being prepared to dig in and how you're best going to defend your turf. And what this young man argues in the civil discourse video is that we have an incredible responsibility, not just to reawaken civil discourse, but to teach civil discourse. And I'll show you some resources that may help with that. But it's a spin, I guess I would say, or an aspect of this conversation in terms of communication that I really hadn't thought about. I think of it so much as around the other four areas, social media, boundaries. But this fifth one I thought was so powerful and thoughtful that I wanted to share it as well as another possible example to work with. I think one of this area is where it's so frequently come up in my conversations, and Cape Elizabeth, is where the Venn diagram of kids' mental health and the opportunities, I would say, that exist for students to be supported or really find themselves totally alone. That Venn diagram, I would say, is often very overlapping. And so for me, having the conversations about mental health issues and how they map onto and relate to social media, to digital communication, digital relationships are critical. So to that end, I pulled up this article from Caroline Knorr, and I'm Caroline Knorr. She works for Common Sense Education and she edits articles for them. And that underneath the photograph, you'll see there's a link there for more of her articles. I think she does a fantastic job. But in this particular one, she talks about 6 areas where we really need to think about how relationships, how those operate or manifest themselves online, and how easy it is for kids to fall into a void where they don't feel supported. These areas, she argues, are the ones where it's most important that we offer support. So steering kids towards healthy interactions. I apologize for that typo. Health interactions. Reserving judgment in our assessment of what they're doing and why they're doing it online. Teaching social media skills as early as possible. This one I could not agree with more. My former colleague and I, Tom Charltray, talked about this constantly. There is no such thing as too soon to be having this conversation. He was the tech integrator at Cape Elizabeth's elementary school, Pond Cove. And we jointly felt that a K-8 conversation, a K-8 discussion was critical, especially starting as early as possible. So I couldn't agree more with Ms. Knorr's point. The fourth, consider what tech is offering our students, not just what it's taking away or endangering or detracting, but what connections is it offering. That can be a great lens through which to look at the situation. Then identifying real world tech-derived stress, that is, what's happening to kids as a result of Zoom fatigue, what's happening to kids as a result of FOMO and feeling like the pandemic in particular, but just in general, the possibility of missing out on opportunities is creating very palpable real world stress that is born of some kind of tech issue, tech anxiety, tech concern, tech conflict. One of the areas that I often talk about this arising was when social media first started becoming really popular. I was teaching in Gorham, and we had a series of really violent morning encounters right after kids were arriving and before the school day started. And it was really odd, and none of us could track it. And suddenly my principal, Chris Record, who's now my superintendent, which is awesome, said, you know what, I think there's, as I talk to these kids and I interview them, it is because social media issues are spilling out from the night before into the morning's conflict. And of course, we have seen that explode, but that realization really helped us figure out how to try to address some of those issues, and is a great example of real world stress, real world conflict arising from tech-derived interactions. And then finally, monitoring and not underestimating offline struggles. That kids may look like they're okay, the kids may look like they're connected, that they're weathering this craziness with no particular difficulty, but assuming that we really need to be all the more vigilant as parents and as teachers about what's happening outside. Carolyn writes really towards parents, but you may know that Common Sense Education is now split off from Common Sense Media. So they're still the same organization, but they treat teachers and schools in one category and parents and families in another, with some overlap, of course. But her articles focus more on the parent side, but this one struck me as really a terrific series of resources and arguments and sort of a framework to think about this conversation. And so I recommend it highly. That link is in the upper left-hand corner. Okay. Caitlin Krauss talks about how we as teachers can model and focus on relationships in a way that helps our classroom dynamics, whether they're in person or remote or hybrid. And there's no sort of rocket science in this, but I was struck by how beautifully she captured the importance of relationship. And it also got me thinking, as you'll see in the next several slides, that we don't think enough about building relationships with our students, especially as they manifest themselves in digital formats, as a focus of our work. I think it often ends up ancillary and kind of in the background, and then we get frustrated by issues that arise. But her argument is that we really have an opportunity here to mindfully develop relationships with students. And so that piece to me was really important. But equally important, as you'll see, is my feeling that we really want to think carefully about how our relationships with our students are modeling the behaviors, the interactions, and the values that we want them having with one another. And I think, as with anything in parenting and teaching, the biggest opportunity to fail in this kind of sort of softer skill is by modeling something different than what we're preaching. That is, displaying behaviors that are different from what we're telling them to do. And so from this, I feel as though there's this article, there's a real opportunity to think about, okay, so what am I, how am I showing up? What am I putting forward to kids that models for them how I would like them behaving towards and with one another? So she observes, as one example, that the trust that you develop and the time you spend on making them feel safe and included is going to pay you back in spades. And the idea, if that's the expression, but anyway, that leaving you with if you're left with the sense that you're wasting time in relationship building, she argues, really you can do nothing more important, because in the basis of those relationships, you gain so much more efficiency and connection and opportunity than if those are in the background and just developed on the fly. So the article really focuses on ways that we can use online learning as a platform with the, I don't want to say admonition because it's not negative, but the advice that we give a great deal of thought to how we connect with our students and what we're showing them we expect and what we value in terms of how we then carry that forward to any lessons or any advice we provide them about their own interactions. So in each of these cases, you'll see there's a link to the full article up above. I'm a huge fan of Michael Matera. I think his work is just phenomenal. He's so positive, he's hilarious, and I met him once and he's a terrific guy. Just so thoughtful and engaged and student focused in the best possible way. So this short video, just to introduce him to you, talks about some opportunities that exist to develop classroom relationships and relationships with your students. But in doing that, he also talks both directly and tangentially about what we're doing when we present values to our kids that are different than what we're that our actions are different than what we're telling them we value. And so he gives this example that so frequently we find ourselves in the mode of thinking about our kids as 1, 2, 3, and 4, or A, B, C, D, F, right? And it's just human nature. It's not a failing on our part, but he gives you some suggestions about how to refocus and get away from that lens so that you're instead really thinking about their intrinsic value before how they're performing in your class. Because the more opportunities you give them to demonstrate thoughtfully and sort of authentically who they are, he argues, the more opportunities you have to get the best out of them. And again, none of this is rocket science, but I love the way in which each of these people very directly maps on digital relationships, interactions online, and the value of focusing on developing relationships, especially around the idea of modeling for our students. So I include them with the hope that you too see that connection and find it valuable. I am a mega fan of Teach Thought. I think they do such a great job, especially with visuals to represent the concepts. And this one, whether it's just a reminder to yourself or up on your faculty room wall, but the argument about student engagement being the first step and really the critical one for any other kind of engagement with your curriculum and with your classes is a terrific one, I think. And the simplicity of these is just a great reminder that this is not difficult per se, right? It's not something that is going to present an insurmountable challenge with our students. It is instead presenting this straightforward, direct, dearth of, I think we think of ourselves as ill-equipped. And what this article and this visual, this infographic points out is that we're not talking about something that is any more difficult online than it is in person. And in fact, the time spent doing that is going to amplify enormously the results we get. So I just thought it was worth sharing in that it is such a great reminder of how simple steps make a huge difference in this area. And it doesn't need to be a huge amount of time. It doesn't need to be, this carefully thought out process. If your goal is developing relationships with them, there are some really straightforward ways to do that and some tools that are pretty easily accessible. The next article I wanted to give you some access to comes from Harvard Graduate School of Education. And the author talks about how we have a scientific basis to know the value of relationships in kids' lives on their development and their overall trajectory for success. And the particular focus on the idea that we can do this systematically, that there are skills to teach, that we can model for them behaviors that we expect from them. And in so doing, give them not just the support they need, but a skill set that it will be invaluable to them going forward. And she argues specifically that there are 4 things we can do that really have the most demonstrated value for students and specifically for the impact of your teaching. So the first, and she offers resources for this, is learning the science behind strong relationships. That is to say, understanding the neurological and the biological requirement for a relationship and the way in which it literally changes brain chemistry to create pathways and openness that otherwise is not there. And armed with that knowledge, she suggests these next 3 will make a lot of sense to you and will offer you the sort of redoubled motivation to understand why this time you're spending, which again can feel like soft time that's away from the curriculum, is actually anything but. And that investment is going to pay back enormously. So second is embracing the power of empathetic listening. Third, practicing genuine vulnerability and showing them your own mistakes and your own pain to the degree that you feel comfortable doing that. And of course, that it's appropriate, that you're giving real access to them. And the article talks about situations where teachers were asked, let's say by administration, to put on a brave face. And so many of them found that that was actually a disservice to their kids. If something tragic had happened in the neighborhood or in the district, or there was some well-known anxiety-producing situation, whether it's local or international. This effort to hide from kids or to sort of mask our responses and our actual feeling made us as teachers feel less trustworthy to them. And she goes on to explain the contrapositive of that, the opposite, that by practicing vulnerability, we invite their vulnerability and provide this great opportunity to connect. And to loop us back to the common sense piece of this, each of these aspects to me really seemed like opportunities, seemed like places where getting some guidance about the why of developing relationships and the how would give you a framework that worked beautifully when you then tried to direct instruct around it with your students. And I also think that your relationship building with them, which, as I said, I feel like should be and must be a priority, can map on beautifully to the common sense education curriculum around not just relating to you, but relating to one another and sort of how we, as I said earlier, show up in the world. That to me provided a rationale to connect these for each of you. And I hope that you too, as you read these, feel empowered by them, feel like they do offer you that opportunity to see how digital citizenship education and relationship building have a wonderfully overlapping synergy that could really give you opportunities that you may not be taking right now and that you may not otherwise have. Finally, the article argues that we need to really give public opportunity, not public opportunities, but public recognition of opportunities to find places to connect and heal. And we know this in the context of trauma, but she argues that in fact, we don't need to think about it as just a trauma response, that we want to normalize mental health issues so much so that seeking out assistance and support is culturally acceptable and leaves people, going back a couple of slides to the idea of checking in with kids and how they're doing, leaves people with a default of connection and a default of a safety net around them, instead of course, we know so tragically what happens when they don't feel that, when students feel like those support systems don't exist. So she argues, before you have the problem, having in place a culture where that's understood to be normative is an invaluable use of resources and time. Sort of a corollary to this, or a piece that I also thought was really nicely connected to the common sense education's focus and thrust, was using empathy as a lens for teaching with these skills with students. And the specific article here is about your worldview using social media as the tool and how you perceive it. But I thought it worked really nicely also as a more a broader reminder that if we take that time to put on, I was joking with one of my colleagues about putting on our empathy glasses, that if someone's behavior seems a little, unexpected or just flat out bizarre, it may be as a result of something that's happening for them that's unique to their experience or common, but not showing on the surface. And I hope I have for you a pretty cool visual to provide that jumping off place for conversations with your colleagues and with students, which I'll show you in a couple of minutes. But the article argues, and this is an ISTE resource, ISTE is the national affiliate of ACTUM, that if we use social media as the topic and we use empathy as the lens, as we look at skills related to, and arguing that those are skills, again, that we're doing a huge disservice to kids if we just leave them on their own to do this. So if we teach the skills for social media engagement and relationships using a lens of empathy, we gain a huge number of skills that have applications elsewhere. So the idea that we would look at information that's presented to us, not just from the summary presented, but behind it, what is the person referencing? And unintentionally, I created a model for that with this presentation, in that I'm asking you to go back and take a look at the resources that informed my executive summaries here, and not just relying on my interpretation, but gaining from the original source your own perspective. That, as a baseline of advice, I thought was terrific. Making sure that you're exchanging ideas with more than one person and more than one type of person, and tagging people that you think would have a perspective on it that was valuable. So as you look at something, giving shout outs, credit, but also, hey, did you see this kind of interaction is a way to um, create connection using social media as a platform, but also, as this points out, to give a clear attribution to the individual from which an idea comes. So that if someone represents themselves as holding a view, you say, okay, where did that view come from? What's the source that provided it? But also, what is the accuracy of their claim around being effectively representing the larger idea, and to say that this person's point of view is different from that group's point of view. The article goes on to talk about really thoughtfully crafting the messages you send. And if appropriate for whatever you're posting, to present any evidence or personal experience that support the opinion that you're expressing. So there's a great deal of work done to quantify and sort of find the necessary skills in the Common Core curriculum for ELA. And this to me seemed like a very brief digest of that concept, that expressing your opinion is great, and should be welcomed, but it is all the more powerful when it can be done with support. And of course, that skill is one that's going to carry over to any kind of writing or discussion in your classroom. But again, if you meet them on the level of their medium in social media, and you also provide the understanding that there's a skill set to develop to be a skilled communicator in a group, to be a skilled member of a discussion, and to write with credible support, these skills transfer really nicely, and they offer almost a microcosm, a thumbnail sketch of what it would look like to do a good job in just a tweet or an Instagram post or whatever it is that they're putting up. One of my Tom Shoftrey, who I mentioned earlier, he would have students do this analog, so they weren't actually posting in social media. He created these kind of Twitter tweet templates, and kids would share analog what their ideas were, and they could work really nicely together to edit those and improve them before they were then transferred to social media. So they were writing them for his account for Pine Cove Technology, and each day a student's expression would be chosen as the one to represent today's experience in the class. And so there was also this kind of carrot of your words will be the ones that represent everyone's experience. But it was a really authentic and low stakes way to do this work, as kids learned about simple things like hashtags and tagging, but more complex ideas like, how are you presenting your point of view? If you're expressing something, is there a visual way to support it? Do you have evidence? Those were each micro lessons embedded in the larger conversation. Then upholding norms and making sure, in particular, if you're familiar with the term IUP, that usually refers to the Internet Use Protocol or Internet Use Agreement, depending on the language that your district uses, but knowing specifically what is required within your district and also what is required by the platform you're using can be a great conversation, because we so often just click on agree to any kind of terms of the conversation, and it's another opportunity to teach skills around careful and sort of critical reading. And then this shared responsibility to consume and contribute, and that if you're just passive or just active, you're missing out on a big part of the experience. And so this particular list is derived from a book by Kristen Mattson called Digital Citizenship in Action. And she expands on these sort of 7 areas as a core series of values or tenets for the conversations around engaging with social media and sort of digital interactions. But then the book expands really nicely, as does the article, on how, with empathy as a lens, with an understanding that your role needs to be inclusive of taking someone else's point of view and seeing why they're expressing what they're expressing, not just looking at it as, you know, an angry tirade, but what experience on their part has led to that point of view. Her book does a really nice job with that, and I would highly recommend it, or at least the full article that captures some more of that sort of framework, that mindset that she uses. I mentioned earlier the Student Voices video about civics, and I went on to find this terrific piece arguing that SEL, social emotional learning, and civics education are closely related and really require thoughtful, skills-based education. That if we leave our students to the wolves to develop these skills, we're going to see exactly what we're seeing, which is, you know, bifurcation and polarization and failure to listen. And she argues, and Cisco argues in this article, that it's not just a naturally derived skill, that it's something that, and the example here at the bottom, as simple as switching from I disagree with Jasmine, I disagree with Jasmine's idea, switching from I disagree with Jasmine to I disagree with Jasmine's idea, or that opinion you expressed is interesting. However, my opinion is derived from this versus you're stupid, right? Those concepts, it's so easy to default to something affrontive and sort of argumentative. And she says, you know, it's not accidental, exactly. It is accidental, I suppose, that kids are ending up in real trouble with the way that they've expressed themselves or unheard, right? That they're not allowing people to access their ideas because the methods are so prickly and so difficult to engage with. And of course, this is a lesson we know over and over again as adults. I'm sure someone on your faculty is coming to mind. But this concept of how we might scaffold those skills and really give attention to developing SEL in an educational setting. It is not just our counselors' responsibility in our schools to teach this, that we engage kids in conversations about civics, about civil discourse, about online presence and how they represent themselves, about their mental health, frequently in as many spheres as possible. Of course, as with anything, is going to be far more successful than siloing it or leaving, you know, the digital citizenship education to the librarian and the SEL to the guidance counselor. That is as ineffective a strategy as there could be. I mean, I suppose it's better to have those things in the curriculum than not, but having them be part of the fabric of your teaching and learning throughout your building is obviously way more impactful and an agent of change than is just naming that these are important and sort of putting them in someone's lap to deal with their complexities and all the different ways they kind of rear their heads if left unattended. Alex Chevron-Vent talks about the reminder that all this time we spend and all this effort we put forward in developing relationships with our students, modeling it, teaching them skills, it's already challenging to find that time and to make time for it. And she says what redoubles that challenge is that you often don't see the results, especially not immediately. And so she says, I think really beautifully here, just because students are not openly responding to relationship building efforts, it does not necessarily mean that the care and support they've received are unappreciated. So just to say, I think, you know, when you're developing an academic skill set, you often see it demonstrated the next time around or not. And then, you know, you need to circle back to it. And her observation is that the fruit of this labor isn't just not always immediately visible. And that is no reason. In fact, that's a good reason to stick with it because it means that they need more attention, they need more support to get it to be normalized and to get it to be their way of being in the world, instead of leaving them hanging, right? Leaving them without a kind of framework that is teachable, but that is so often ignored. This really simple, but I thought wonderful piece, gives you 14 easy messages to share with students. And again, the idea of modeling for them how you'd like them to be with one another, how you'd like them to interact with you. They really are, they're almost reductive, but not so much so that they're not really each a great reminder. So there's 14 and I offer two of them here. The first one is, it's not how much you know, but what you do with what you know, right? And this one comes back to me over and over again in so many contexts, but why are we teaching skills around fixed technique instead of how to learn technique, right? Similarly, why are we teaching information versus information gathering skills? The catchphrase, I guess I would say the slogan for Waynfleet School here in Portland is learn to learn. And I think that is the simplest expression I've heard of what to me is such an important reminder that what we want to evaluate in our students isn't what they know, but what they do with what they know, and especially what skills they develop to know more. So these 14 reminders all kind of center on that general principle, but equally valuable as a reminder that, as with Michael Matera's piece, if we are not careful, we end up reducing our kids to their performance in our classes. And this number 3, I thought was so poignant and well phrased. The word smart doesn't mean anything, so you and I aren't going to use it anymore. Like, what a terrific message to send in a classroom, right? That you are accustomed to hearing, you student are accustomed to hearing that there's a certain benchmark, a certain performance, there's a certain expectation around skills that you are able to demonstrate. And so often the implication or the underlying assumption is you're either good at that or you're not, right? And of course, we know that anything can be learned. We know that there is so much opportunity to teach that molds an ability to learn, that really the key first step, and I apologize if I feel a little preachy here, but as I read these, I just was so struck by how simple they were and how easy it is to default to what I would argue is the wrong position of, well, he's just not a smart kid, right? He's not going to get this, versus sending the message explicitly, not just implicitly, but explicitly in your classroom that smart is a meaningless word, right? You may have seen it. If you haven't, I would encourage you to look at some of them. The original SAT and original IQ questions, we can argue about whether they've gotten all that much better, but there was a period of time when the test was, one of the images was of a house and there was a chimney on the house. And then in the neighboring house, there was no chimney. And the question was, what is missing from this picture? And if you were Italian taking this, you said a cross, because to you, the house looked like a house. And you didn't see them as asking you, especially if you had a language barrier, what's missing between the left and right photo. They were seeing it as a village. And what was missing was the thing that was a chimney was in fact a tower. And what was missing from the top was a cross. And if they didn't say the chimney is missing, they were judged to have missed the question, right? But the cultural context for them made their answer far more correct than a chimney. And so until we re-examine question the question, we are making assumptions about a kid's intelligence or about their skills that could be based on nothing, right? And I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir here, and this is not known to you, but this simple digest of that we so often default to, well, he is or isn't a smart kid, it is that basis, that simple statement that creates so many other problems. And if we are communicating, if we're developing relationships around the idea that we're not going to be judged by those external metrics, and that instead we're going to be judged by the skills we develop and our ability to and interest in and engagement in developing those skills, it's just such a, it's a pretty significant shift, but can be such a subtle turning of the dial to get to the place where we feel like the values that our classrooms demonstrate are around the ones that we would want them to demonstrate, right? That we were hoping that they leave us understanding that skills can be developed and not that they're innate skills are the things that we're judging them by. So again, back to this big picture of modeling what we hope they'll do, that sort of empathy, that sense of really thoughtfully engaging kids in conversation and in skilled conversation about what's important, and around vulnerability. There is definitely vulnerability in saying that we're going to abandon the word smart in your classroom. And these other 12 that are here are each equally, to me, thought-provoking, and I hope you'll explore them to get a sense of how simple it can be. And as I said earlier, Teach Thought, I think, is a terrific resource if it's not one you've explored. But this one in particular just gave me, it was like snapshots of things that we would hope that our students are hearing, and why each of those messages is so important and so transformative to their perception of your classroom and of you, and of what you might, the skill set and the kind of mindset, I would say, that they would develop in your classroom to take out into the world. This I mentioned earlier, that there's this pair of cartoonists, Liz and Molly, who I somehow had missed. And I found them the other day, and I was blown away by the hilarity and the poignancy and the simplicity of their expressions. And each of these to me is a great reminder of what we don't see when we look at our students that may be going on for them, something I referenced earlier, or our colleagues. And the idea that what they're showing on the surface is never going to be the full story. And again, this is not rocket biology, as we say, but it is really a critical reminder. And these each, I thought, could spark terrific conversations depending on the age group you're working with, depending on whether you're talking to adults or kids. But I also just want to introduce you to Liz and Molly because I feel like they are gold and somehow had escaped my view. So we talk about ways to model the kinds of relationships we'd like our students to develop and demonstrate. Each of these, I thought, provided a framework for a conversation, and they're quite simple, as you'll see, but they do such a good job of sparking a thought, sparking a conversation that I can imagine. I shared them with some of my colleagues, and we went on 20, 30 minutes of chatting about what each of them was making us think of. And then one of my colleagues said, they went down the Liz and Molly rabbit hole, as you may after you see this. So the first one is the difference between our first glance and our closer look. And I'll just read to you down there in case it's hard to see on your screen. So on top, we see the folder called anger, but we don't see the subfolders called pain, the subfolder of that grief, powerlessness, vulnerability, and fear. That so often we mistake anger for anger, when anger is in fact all of these other components or an outcropping of those. And again, going back to this lens of empathy, using this as a discussion starter with kids about, so what are you seeing them present online? Do you think that's accurate, or what might be happening behind that? That person who's railing and freaking out and angry, or the person who is very opinionated, very one-sided in their point of view, what might have created that? And so this just sort of microcosm reminder, tiny opportunity to discuss the difference between the big folder and then the subfolders. And I also really liked the framework for it, thinking about a behavior as being the top level, and then being dependent on or comprised of these other components. This one, it took me a second to realize that they turned it sideways, right? If you look at it from above, it can feel like, and it says, you're going in circles, but if you turn it, as they say, flip your perspective here, in fact, you may be circling, but you're circling up. And that too, as a reminder for how your teaching and learning is going, that you have these moments where you're like, oh God, why am I spending so much time on relationship building, or why am I spending so much time on digital citizenship? In that moment, it may not be obvious to you, but what in fact is very likely happening is this circling upward. And of course, I also like the larger message about our own progress as teachers and as people in the world, that so often we do feel like we're going in those circles, and here we are flipping the paradigm to see that yes, we are circling back, but we're doing so with growth at the same time. This one I love, and I don't know that it's so much for students as it is really just a great reminder to teachers at this moment about how enormous the task of teaching and learning is, and how stressful it is. That it's on top here, it says what I expect of myself, the large circle, and this tiny little dot is what one person is physically capable of doing. It's just such a nice little post-it to put up for yourself on the wall there, right? You set expectations for yourself that are so high. And the reality is that you're doing such a good job and working so hard. And the lack of reality testing that we so often do, defining yourself by your failures. I just thought this was a wonderful visual to say, let's hold on a second. And this message too about the difference between, and you can use this in a number of contexts. And in fact, Liz and Molly have some others that are the same graphic, but with different labels. Like the big circle is how I perceive the mistake I made, and the little dot is how others perceive the mistake I made. That just concept and conversation with kids, saying to them, what else might this diagram represent along these lines? I bet they'd come up with some pretty great moments, how I felt tripping in the cafeteria, what other people remember about when I tripped in the cafeteria. So this one actually blew up because it's really hard to see on the screen, I'm sure. The general labels are what we see and then what we don't. But in each of these cases, the figure is embraced or haunted or connected to something else. So this one is chronic depression, loss, past trauma, anxiety, and illness. And I thought, even if it's not one of those five, the difference between what we see and what we don't is so critical to how we show up in the world, how we show up online, how our kids are experiencing our classes, whether they're in person, hybrid, or distance learning. That just this, again, like I can imagine having the work of these two artists just all over my classroom, all over my office wall, to provide some perspective and just to remind me, like, it feels like your own burden so much of the time, and yet it is a experience so many others are having. And when we look out into the world, we see, if we don't put on our empathy glasses, someone's behavior as, obnoxious, abrasive, whatever. And in fact, there are those people, but there's much more frequently, of course, some greater experience that's influencing and creating those behaviors. And that, again, the express conversation about that with our students can be invaluable, because it is, if you don't have the language for that, if you don't have the norms for it, you end up fighting uphill battles with the explosive kid, or the kid who has no way to hear you when you say, it seems like you're having a really tough day, Tommy. What's happening for you? Instead of being like, leave me alone. If you've created the relationship where that's a norm, it really becomes an opportunity instead of a barrier. And so I really feel like I'm being very preachy today. I'm sorry for that. But it just, as I was doing the work to prepare for this, I was reminded again and again of how often we overlook these opportunities for relationship building and the really wonderful tools that exist to do so. So up to this point, many of the tools I'm suggesting are ones for you to use in your own practice developing relationships with students. In a moment, we'll turn to the Common Sense Education Curriculum, which is totally student facing. But if you have developed a culture where these skills are valued and where relationship building is an intentional piece of what you do, the difference in how the lessons go and the difference in how thoughtfully kids will engage in the conversation is astounding. And I have seen both. That is, I've seen these lessons taught out of the blue to students who've never really talked about this before, and they can be powerful and they can be surprisingly fruitful. But when you contrast it with a classroom where this is normative, and now you're layering on the conversation about digital relationships and online behaviors, 9 times out of 10, that second situation, the latter, is going to be really far more engaging and impactful in terms of how kids leave the space and what they take out into the world from the conversation. And this last one, specific to the conversations about social media, the left-right axis says amazing things on the top and really hard things on the bottom. Then the big circle is represented as someone's life, being about half of each. And then the little pink bubble on the top, what they post on social media, right? And this is a conversation kids have all the time. And in fact, two of the Kids' Voices videos that I mentioned earlier from Common Sense Education reference this exact point, that the person you present in social media is totally different than the person. And that dissimilarity is so easy to forget and leads to so much unfair comparison and so much kind of beating yourself up when, if you pause and you think about it for a minute, you know the fact is that what they're representing is not truthful, it's not complete, it's not a actual portrait of their life. But in the forum of social media, the norm has become that kind of unrealistic curation, and the result is that we're sucked completely into it. And we know this is for body image, we know it's for popularity, wealth, each of these aspects that are so misrepresented by the stories that people are telling in, and I always think it's fascinating that Instagram calls them stories, the stories that people are telling versus what would happen if we were to represent our real lives. There's a really hilarious exercise offered by I think it's actually part of the Common Sense Education. No, sorry, it's part of the Google Digital Citizenship Curriculum, where they ask you to create a day in the life, a realistic portrait of your day in social media. And just that concept is hilarious. Like went to the bathroom, ate an egg. The mundaneness of it is a really great opportunity to talk about what you would post to present your best self. And that isn't to say that you don't want to talk to kids about curating their choices to be things they're proud of, but that's different than misrepresenting or skewing things to the idealized. And that nuanced conversation, the earlier you start it, the more fruitful it's going to be going forward, and the better able kids will be to use that lens to ask, to critically think about what they're seeing. I think another sort of good luck with that theory that we have developed is we leave kids to encounter social media, encounter news even, with no skill sets, just to fall prey to the traps that are being set for them by social media. And if this is not something you've heard in the context of the Facebook revelations from the whistleblower, she said that the metric, the formula that's used, the algorithm, when you are using Facebook, you click on something positive and it counts as, let's say, 1 point towards the next machine learning choice that's going to be made for you. If you click on something negative, it counts as 4 points. In other words, each time you click on something screaming and yelling, negative, critical, that overall genre of negative interactions with the world has 4 times the value in the next thing you see that Facebook chooses for you than the one positive thing you clicked on. So it's as if you clicked on 4 negative things each time you click on one versus only one positive thing each time you click on one. In other words, the bias of your machine learned narrative is immediately and very swiftly turned negative. If kids don't know that, then they just fall into the trap, as many adults do, to believe that all that negativity is what defines the conversations in the larger world. And unfortunately, of course, there's a great deal of accuracy to that, but is not a universal truth. And if they know that they're being steered towards more negative once they choose negative, that tool alone is so powerful in helping them develop skills to figure out what to do about that, to take things with a grain of salt, to click on the positive things, to click on someone else's point of view so that your feeds don't become so narrow and so curated to the point that they don't represent reality. Instead, follow some people you disagree with, follow some news sources that are very left and very right leaning, so that the sum total is more accurate. And so you're developing an acumen for that critical thinking and looking at those with a lens for the assumption that no one of them is truth and no one of them represents the reality of someone's life or someone's experience. And then you wrap into that the idea of developing intentional skills around empathy as a lens, understanding why they have reached that place. you really quickly delve into some very rich conversations. And I have many teachers say to me, like, this is not my job, right? This is an area, this is too mushy and it's too much touchy-feely. And my argument is, I understand why that's the case. And in fact, I understand there's a range of comfort for people about engaging these conversations. But the basic concept that there are skills to be employed in critically thinking about information presented to you and thinking very carefully about what you present is not touchy-feely. It's just like teaching math equations or grammar rules. You are teaching them what they need to know to be effective digital communicators. So what might that look like in the context of a curriculum? Let's take a look